Have you ever wondered, why is Africa still poor? I mean, how did we go from wealthy kingdoms to slave trade, colonization, our lack of economic dependence, and the poor governance generally? How did we become consumers of what we do not produce and producers of what we cannot consume? So in this video, we'll be talking about some factors that has contributed to the underdevelopment of Africa. Slavery existed in Africa long before the Europeans came, but it escalated madly with the arrival of the European traders and the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade. Before the Europeans came, slaves in Africa were often prisoners of war, criminals whose punishment were to be slaves. Even in most cases, people earned their freedom and were able to marry, sometimes even rise into positions of power. There was massive demand for labor because of plantations where stuffs like sugar, tobacco, cotton were produced. So in turn, there was a mad escalation in slave rates and war. This was the most dehumanizing form of slavery ever recorded. The transatlantic slave trade is a topic on its own. It lasted about 400 years, and in those 400 years, a lot of anti-slavery wars were fought. And that was how so many African kingdoms collapsed. Communities were depopulated, and the traditional system of governance was totally disrupted. A lot happened over this period of slavery, but over time slavery ended and then made way for colonization. Colonization is when a country takes over another area, usually to control its land, resources and its people. So I believe you have heard about the Berlin Conference of 1884. European nations competed for African territories. The Berlin Conference was where the whole thing was finalized without any African input. Now remember, the depopulation of African communities during slave trade era reduced and deprived Africa of its skilled workforce. So Africa's resources exploitation, coupled with the losses through slavery, took the continent to a point of no return. This is why, even after many African countries gained independence, they all still had economic challenges, and because of that, many African countries remained reliant on exporting raw materials to Europe for manufactured goods. The lack of infrastructures left nations with weak industries, which further promotes the dependence on foreign everything, including aid. African nations rely heavily on borrowing money to run their countries, which keep them in too much debt. There are other factors like political instability and systemic corruption, because the post-colonial governance was filled with corruption. Elites diverted public funds for personal gain, while foreign corporations exploited resources through bribery. This further derailed national development and poverty deepened. Ethnic differences, wars and other forms of violence are also other factors that has derailed Africa's development. The impacts of conflicts like the Nigerian Civil War, the Rwandan genocide and the apartheid in South Africa cannot be underestimated. We would also see that today, there are still coups. Terrorist groups like Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab continue to pose a threat. In fact, it is safe to say that Africa is on a loop. Everything we have mentioned so far are still happening around Africa till today. Big corporations are still exploiting Africa in plain sight. Mismanagement of funds, bribery and all of these things being mentioned here are not the new story. They are still happening right now. Now, despite these challenges, recent initiatives emphasizes intra-African trade and entrepreneurship, reducing reliance on the international market. Africa still faces obstacles like climate change, corruption and infrastructural gap. However, a new generation of educated Africans are driving entrepreneurship and innovation, fostering optimism for the future.